Lobster season is just around the corner. I'm gonna help you make sure that you have the right gear so you can go out there and grab your own lobster. Let's dive in. The first thing you're gonna need is a lobster card, which is this really long piece right here. This you can get at your local sporting goods store. You're gonna go in, you have to have a fishing license first with the saltwater extension, and then you can purchase a lobster card. This will set you back a whopping $10.80. Used to be 7 something, but not much at all, but it is this long. You need this on you when you go out and go for lobster. If you're shore diving, make sure to fill this out prior. Everything on this card needs to be filled out prior to your dive, except the last column, which is lobsters retained. Outside of that, you're gonna wanna make sure you have this before you do any sort of diving. This is valid from October 1st at 6 a.m. to March 22nd is the last day of season. So make sure you have your lobster card first. Next up is the Lobster Gauge, which is this piece right here. You're gonna wanna make sure you have a solid device that helps measure the carapace of the lobster, so it's legal. The legal size is 3¼ inch from the carapace. This is right between the eyes, all the way back to the end of the carapace. You wanna make sure this is handy. You wanna make sure whatever gauge you buy, it is accurate. It can't be manipulated very well because you wanna make sure that distance is correct. For me, I have it on this torch right here. I found when I'm shore diving, I like it on the torch instead of having it separate, because when you have 2 hands and you're trying to measure the lobster and hold it at the same time, it's a really big hassle. So I have this piece right here, the gauge on my torch, and it's really easy to measure and see very clearly. So make sure you have your lobster gauge on you. Next up, you're gonna wanna make sure you have your lobster gloves. So these are pretty much any glove that has some protection against those spikes on the California spiny lobster. They will prick you pretty hard. In this case, I use these gloves. They have some additional padding on top. Yours does not need to have this. This is just so when you shoot your hands into holes, it protects your hand from getting scuffed up while you're reaching for lobster. Whatever you're comfortable with, just make sure your fingers can move around freely, so you have the dexterity to grab the lobster, handle your gauge and all that, but make sure you have some gloves. Next piece is gonna be the bag. So essentially where you're gonna put the lobster. If you are going to be shore diving and if you're going with a bunch of dive buddies without a buoy, so somewhere close where you wanna go between rocks, you're not gonna have a buoy with you, I would recommend something like this. This is a waist strap bag. Essentially, this goes around your waist and you hold the lobster as you catch them in this little pouch. So think of it as like a fanny pack for lobster. So this is my recommendation. It does get a little cumbersome once you start loading this up with some lobster, because it's obviously additional weight and be bumping against your leg, but this is what I would recommend. This is what I typically go with when I go lobster diving. If you have a float, I would recommend obviously a bag like this. You can get ones that are a little fancier that have the quick release where you just squeeze the handle, it'll open up. But something simple like this, open it up, put the lobster in there, good to go. One pointer I will recommend is, from my experience, if you're looking for a lobster bag, look for something where the netting is just on the bottom and you have this more canvas material on the top. And that's because when you stick in the lobster, those spikes will stick to this mesh and it'll be really tough to get them in. It's not that tough, but it's a little frustrating when you're trying to get in lobster and you're trying to have to wiggle it down, versus if it's this canvas material, it'll more or less slide down. So that's what I would recommend if you're going for this bag option. But me personally, usually I'm going for this waist option. Next up, you're gonna make sure you have a light or a torch. I have here some Princeton Tech 420 and a 500. I use this 500, this is my buddy's with the gauge on it. Mine will have a gauge on it, but make sure you have a torch, whether you're daytime diving or especially obviously nighttime, you wanna make sure you have a light. And a good rule of thumb is more lumens doesn't necessarily mean more better. Because you have more lumens doesn't mean you'll see more. Sometimes it's quite the opposite. It actually will reflect off of the particulates in the water, and you will see less actually. You just see a lightsaber of a beam and be unusable. So make sure you have a torch even during the day. They are in those holes and you want to be able to see that. So find one that's comfortable for you. This is an optional piece of having your flashlight or your torch, is having this wrist strap here that can actually release upon applying a decent amount of pressure. This is more of a safety feature, especially if you're going into those holes. If your light gets stuck for whatever reason, you can pull out like that. So imagine that being around your wrist and you're pulling straight out. This will release. Obviously you'll be able to swim to the surface and then you can hopefully go get it. If not, at least you're safe. You can always reset these by just snapping these two plastic pieces together, put it around your wrist and you're ready to go. But this is a little extra piece for safety and comfort, but it's not required, and add it if you'd like. Last but certainly not least, probably one of the most important things, it's a indicator light. So essentially a light to help identify yourself to your fellow divers on where you are, especially at night. This guy, the one I have, is battery operated with a AAA battery. Many of the ones on the market are water activated and you can't replace the battery, but they're pretty good. They blink various colors and whatnot, but I would highly recommend investing in either I like this because it's reusable and I could just keep swapping out the batteries, or you could just buy a bundle of the water activated ones. Keep it on your weight belt so your other fellow divers know exactly where you are. So this, do not neglect it. It's super cheap. And that's all the extra gear you'll need this season for lobster. Just a reminder, the daily limit for spiny lobster is 7 per day, and make sure your lobster is legal. I know that sounds ridiculous, but make sure it's legal. You measure from between the eyes to the end of the carapace. If it's rubbing or clicking at the end, that's what we call a clicker, unofficial word, and it's really tempting to take it, do not take it. If you get caught, it is not worth it. That's not legal. Make sure it's clearly over the minimum gauge requirement, which is 3¼ inches. But outside of that, be safe. If you're going out at night especially, or even during the day, tell others where you'll be diving and roughly for how long. But outside of that, have a great season and dive safe.